Hello everyone, thank you for being here. So I'm Joshua Bell, I'm an epidemiologist at the University of Bristol. This is a field of science that you probably are aware of because it often gets kind of thrown at you with really kind of unhelpful and confusing ways. I mean, you've all seen things like this, for example. We hear about topics like obesity and type 2 diabetes all the time, and the body mass index, and how one day it's a terrible measure of health and we shouldn't be using it, until the next day when it's a good measure of health after all and you should carry on using it. And we hear topics like inactivity or lack of exercise is apparently worse for health and deadlier than obesity, how walking can help prevent a heart attack, but apparently doing too much of it can give you a heart attack. How apparently just sitting down less can cut your risk of diabetes. That was based on my study, and I have no idea what they're talking about. So that one is. So hopefully I'll do a little bit better than this, and hopefully bring a bit of clarity to these topics. So what is true? Well, we know that what is true that obesity has increased quite a lot in recent years. It's more than doubled in just a few decades. This is the current picture in England, where we're looking at the prevalence of overweight or obesity, which is pushing about 80% in some age groups. This is generally more common among men than women, whereas the rates of actual obesity, which is based on a body mass index or BMI of 30 or higher, is about 1 in 3 in some age groups. So this isn't news to anyone. We kind of know this. We hear about it all the time. Something I think we hear less about, but we probably should, is how these gains over time have been distributed. So this is sort of not as widely known. So this is just using health survey data from England, so taking 2 repeated snapshots of the general population and looking at gains across different levels of BMI, so going from lowest to highest. And what we've seen quite clearly is that much of the gains have they've not been equally distributed. They're sort of more common among people who were already kind of on the higher end of the BMI scale. We see this in other countries as well. So we know that while our environment has become more, we call obesogenic, and that it encourages a lot of overconsumption, we also know that people respond very differently, or they get very different tendencies to gain. So we've known for quite a while that weight has a kind of a strong genetic contribution to it. What we've only learned very recently, and by recently I mean like a month ago, is how early in life it really kind of starts to show. So this is using repeated measures from a cohort study that's based here in Bristol called Children of the 90s, where back in the early 1990s, over 14,000 pregnant women were recruited, and them and their children and their children's children are being followed up ever since. So because we have repeated measures of people at different stages of life right from the beginning, we can try and see how someone's inherited genetic susceptibility to obesity, which is on the bottom scale, relates to weight. So we're looking for clear patterns of trend, which is right here. So this is at age 18. And what we can kind of see is there's a little bit of that right at birth, not very much, but it comes quite strong really at the age of nearly 4. So it happens quite early in life, which is something we wouldn't really know unless we had really good repeat measures from the very beginning. And so what about BMI itself? It's sort of a measure we love to hate. It's just a measure that's purely based on height and weight. So it's just a ratio of the two, of squared height. So it has right away kind of very obvious criticisms to it. It doesn't separate mass from fat or mass from muscle, and it doesn't tell you where fat is in the body. So does that matter? Well, because we also have measures of BMI alongside more objective measures of fat from body scanning, we can look at how they relate with each other. And we do see that they do relate quite strongly with total fat. So BMI relates a lot more strongly with fat than it does for muscle mass. And also quite strongly with fat sort of in the trunk area, which is meant to be the real kind of driver of effects. And we also find is that because we have repeat measures, we can look at gain. So this is now looking over here. It's like the pattern of effect of gain in BMI with different health outcomes, so markers in the blood, so cholesterol, triglycerides, etc. This is the pattern you see with BMI, and this is the pattern you see with more objectively measured fat mass, which is pretty much exactly the same thing. So for our purposes, when we do kind of group level research, looking for trends and sort of cause and effect in populations, what we do find is BMI, at least for this, does quite a good job of it, which is good news because, one, it's already measured everywhere. Two, it costs virtually nothing to do. It's very cheap. And because of that, we can measure it at really large scale, so in lots of, in huge numbers of people, which is what we would need to do when we're looking at risk of disease. So in doing that, say if the outcome we care about is type 2 diabetes, then what we do is take lots of measurements on people, different measurements on people, large groups of people, and then follow them up over many years and compare the tendencies for getting different, or either getting the disease or not. So you can kind of compare risk. This is what happens when we do that for 2 exposures, so different levels of physical activity and different levels of BMI. So grouped in activity is high, intermediate, and low, normal, overweight, and obesity. This is a pooling of about 120,000 people, I think, done a few years ago, where we can see that both do definitely affect risk. So this is the risk of developing type 2 diabetes over several years. But for this outcome, at least, the effect sizes are not really in the same ballpark. Yes, there's increased risk for low versus high, but then also increased risk of a bigger magnitude between high BMI, which is what we call obesity, versus normal weight here. So they both are definitely relevant for type 2 diabetes, but when we look comparing the size of effects, one sort of definitely has a greater, or is of a greater magnitude. So doing the same thing, this represents higher risk, this represents lower risk of coronary heart disease now. So this is doing the same sort of thing where we measure people, follow them up over many years. This is a pooling, again, of data. So this is based on, I think, 650,000 people, and this one's about 1.8 million people, so we're on a very large scale now. And we do see that both, again, do affect risks. So for higher versus lower levels of activity, this is a protective effect, and higher versus lower levels of BMI, this is an adverse effect, something harmful. Again, so they both do affect risk, and they are now in the same ballpark. So it is kind of, there is slightly greater effect for BMI, but they are kind of more in the same, they're in the same ballpark. So these past two, at least for these outcomes, the methods that are used, what we call observational. So we pretty much just observe what happens. We don't intervene on anything. We don't randomize. So for example, if you want to really show if something has a real causal effect or not, randomization is definitely the way to go. So for example, if you want to know if a drug works, you wouldn't just compare people who take a drug versus not and see what happens in the future because you haven't given them the drug randomly. People differ in lots of other ways. We obviously can't, ideally we sort of can do a trial scenario. We can't obviously randomize people to higher or lower BMI or activity and follow them up over many years. That's neither practical nor ethical. So what we can do instead is look to genes, because in principle they've kind of done this for us, right, when we were conceived. So this is using a method called Mendelian randomization, which is quite the modern use of it was pioneered here in Bristol, and it's sort of being developed every month, it feels like. So this is based on what we know so far. So it's like a way of using genetics or genes as sort of proxies for modifiable exposures. So it's kind of the principle being that the kind of type of genetic variant you get is kind of a random event at conception. So it doesn't relate in the same way as measured traits. So it kind of gives us a better idea of cause and effect. So this, based on what's known so far from 2 of those types of studies, on about 300,000 people or so, what we see for higher BMI. So this is like per typical standard deviation. It's like per extra dose of BMI or activity. Again, a protective effect for physical activity, and then a higher or kind of more adverse effect for BMI. Again, we see a greater magnitude for BMI than we do for activity. And yeah, so that kind of gives us a little more confidence that what we're looking at is something that's kind of a cause and effect and not just something that's, marking something else. So that puts activity in a bit of not a great light, but there is some good news for it. This is now not the genetic method, but this is again observing people over their lifetime. Activity, we know obviously it's a behavior and it changes a lot. So people are prone to doing lots of different patterns across their life because it's less stable over someone's life than BMI is. So what we can do is look at different patterns. So this is done elsewhere. So in the US, this is comparing different patterns of activity and the risk of dying from a heart attack or some type of heart disease, compared with this group here, which are people who are doing very little or nothing consistently over these ages. So compared with these, yes, people who do consistently a lot have lower risk of that outcome, which is the negative by about 40% lower, but then so do people here. So do people who are dipping here, or people who were active, were not there, and then gained it back up again, and those who consistently increasing over their life. So it kind of tells us something about the nature of the effect of activity and how, yes, it's great to, we can kind of aim to be, consistently active, but then that it's also never too late. And the people who are newly active or who kind of begin, a path to making it more regular, that brings a lot of benefit as well. So there is that sort of good news. We've done a very similar thing again with the children in the 90s cohort, because we have repeated measures of device-measured activity. So there's a lot of problems with just simply asking people how often they move. If someone asked you how many minutes did you move last week or even yesterday, it would be very difficult to. I'd probably make it up. So this instead, where we have a device, so it's like an accelerometer. You've sort of seen it before. So this is 3 different time periods. So this is measured over about 5 years or so, which is quite rare to have. And then looking at specifically seeing whether does the effect of current activity differ or depend on your previous activity level. And what we find is that there are definite benefits, but then they don't generally differ so much depending on what someone did before, which again gives a sort of message where, yes, it's never too late to benefit, but then there's kind of a flip side to it, I guess, or a different side where once you begin, you kind of have to keep doing it. It's a kind of a short-term effect. So it's not be the case where I went to the gym last year and I'm fine, I'm set, unfortunately. But so it's kind of, there's sort of the two sides of that. I'm also not recommending that you be active once and take a very long break and then gain it back up again, because there are definite benefits to activity beyond just the 2 that we've seen. There's definite benefit for muscle strength, energy levels, mood, etc. There are many other reasons to kind of keep it up more often. It's worth doing. So yes, now because it is kind of a transient effect, we'd say, and that you really need to maintain it to kind of keep going from the point of now. What we need to do, obviously, is remove kind of barriers that help or make activity difficult to maintain, difficult to keep up. So we're used to, when we think of relationship between BMI and activity, we usually think of it this way around, and that's true. So this is based on the same sort of new genetic evidence that we have. But then we're also learning, which we've thought less about over recent years, but now we're getting, I guess it's becoming more widely known, is that the effects also go in the reverse direction. And so higher BMI does also have an effect on just habitual movement. So this is just recorded activity over a week, say, or the average amount per day. So yes, we often think of it this way, but we have to be aware that it also goes this way as well. So when we're looking at things that can make maintaining activity more difficult to do, this is something that's sort of worth tackling to try and make that more easy. So clearly there's a bit more to it than just that. This sort of skittle-looking thing in the middle is energy balance, and about a decade ago people put together this to try and compile everything that we sort of knew at the time of what influences it. So food, so diet, energy intake is one of the big causal drivers of current weight. That obviously being influenced by the environment we're in, the food environment, what food is available, how much we move on a daily basis, depending on obviously what kind of built environment that allows us to move. Are we able to actively commute, or are we bound by cars? Obviously genetic acceptability, psychology. So it's definitely not, it's by no means a matter of just choice of any kind. It's just very much, there are definite pressures and structural things going on that make, any immediate behavior of either eating or moving kind of structured. So it's definitely a complicated thing. If it was simple, these wouldn't be problems really. And there's a lot more going on. So what about this? We've been talking so far about patterns. So trends, patterns. So what about someone who, Winnie, we love her. She's smoked for 93 years. She lit her 100th birthday cake with her 170,000th cigarette, and no intention of stopping. And why would she? So we can all think of exceptions to all of these trends, and they're definitely there. And I mean, the same applies for weight or BMI, and anything else really you can think of, any kind of risk factor. So why isn't that a problem? It's not really a problem. It's expected. It's just part of nature, because we know that there are real differences between individuals and populations. And what we've been doing is looking at population rates. So we know that, but it's for good reason, because we know that between individuals, the nature of risk involves, yes, what people do, so what they sort of eat and move, etc., but then also genetic susceptibility and just a big dose of luck as well. I mean, that is a real thing. But then the thing is, because these two are big players, they don't really play so much in this. So in the population side, where things between populations are very much, they're more predictable, they're more measurable, and we can understand them much better. So to try and illustrate that briefly, you can imagine two distinct places. So they're geographically apart, say two different cities, maybe they're New York or London, they could be anywhere. They're demographically similar, they do behave similarly, except for one thing, in which case this place, so say New York, no one smokes any cigarettes a day. And in this place, London, everyone smokes a lot, 50 cigarettes a day. And then imagine you can follow them up, say over 50 years, you would expect rates of lung cancer to be much more common in here, would you not? Yeah, for sure. And you would attribute that difference to smoking. You'd say smoking caused this big gap or burden that you'd expect to see when you follow them up over time. So what about within each place? So in this place where no one smokes any cigarettes a day, would smoking cause lung cancer? No, because no one's smoking, so the exposure is not there. What about in this place? Would smoking cause lung cancer? Nope. Nope. I mean, yes and no, mostly no. Because if everyone is smoking the exact same amount, whatever it is that decides whether some person gets a disease and one person not, it has to be something different, right? It can't be smoking, it has to be some other factor, usually genetics, usually luck. So the crucial difference here is that we'll have to distinguish between individuals and between populations. Because within each place here, I mean, yes, smoking would be a lot more common here. Lung cancer would be a lot more common here. But you wouldn't attribute that difference really to differences in smoking, because people don't differ in smoking. They differ in the other things, which are genes and their bad luck. But that is not at all to say that those cases couldn't have been prevented, right? Because smoking is driving it, even though it's kind of a higher level effect. So there are sort of the nature of it's a bit different between individuals and between populations. It's quite plausible and very, common even, to have something that is both highly genetic between individuals and highly preventable on a larger scale. So it kind of sets up why we do these things, because it's the only way we can really understand what we could have avoided. Because really, once you tackle this, the big difference in the main exposure, the driving force, these sort of individual level differences don't matter as much, because it would be controlled by kind of a higher level one. Does that sound strange? Yes, it's strange. So another strange thing. So we've sort of covered that we've pretty much well established by now that sort of higher BMI groups, the higher the risk of developing this outcome, so type 2 diabetes, and that's represented by the red line, right? So this is the risk or the odds for developing the outcome, which, as you expect, is just very high the more higher this gets. But where do most of the cases of the disease come from? Where do they arise from? Those are the blue bars, which is from here. So yes, the risk is highest in this group, but most of the cases come from this group, and especially combined with these two groups. So the majority are from the lower risk groups. Why would that be?
More often.
Yes. That was faster than I thought. So we have one more to get through before we get here. Anyway, it's more obvious than I thought then, okay. I should have done the other way around. Okay, so this is again just like, it's the same, we sort of see the same thing for glucose to type 2 diabetes, and this is now for glucose, so HbA1c, which is like a longer term measure of glucose, and the risk of dying of heart disease. So again, the risk is much higher here. But then the white bars here showing the total percentage of cases. So again, yes, the risk is here, but most cases come from over here. And as you've already said, you beat me to it, because it's common, and that a large number of people at low risk, even though the risk is low, can produce more cases of disease than a small number of people who are at high risk. And it is just a simple matter of commonality, of how common it is. But the implications are pretty big in that you can't just focus on people who are at the very extreme, because you've missed a huge chunk of where diseases come from. So it's almost like it's not quite true to say that most disease comes from healthy people, but it's kind of, it's sort of a paradox of where, you would miss a good chunk of the overall burden of disease if you were to not focus on people who we consider in the normal range. And that's sort of a good principle of why we do what we do. So to sum up a bit, yes, BMI and activity are both major public health challenges. They're both unsolved challenges. No country has really managed to reduce obesity. It's sort of plateauing in places, but no one has managed to reduce it. It's a very kind of stubborn thing. Same for activity, or similar for activity. Both do affect risk of type 2 diabetes and heart disease. The effects tend to be a bit, in case of diabetes, much stronger for BMI, in case of heart disease, a bit stronger. And for activities, current levels are really what will matter. I should also clarify, when I say current, I don't mean never stop moving. This is more, it's not like a minute by minute time scale. It's like sort of on the scale of years. So it's just to sort of say that if there's a period of life where activity was very low, it's not too late to sort of pick it up again, and the benefits come pretty quick. So in that sense, if back to the original title, it's more because we also know that there's sort of a backwards pressure in how higher levels of BMI can have an effect on just reducing the rate of overall movement. It kind of can flow this way. So if you sort of putting them in order, it may go more like that. But as I've said before, which is really sort of the main point, we're talking about rates, so causes of rates. This is not a cause in any one individual. And we do that for a very good reason, because we need to do that to understand what we could have avoided. We would never know what you can avoid if you don't sort of look in the higher level cause and compare. If a disease is common somewhere, and it's rare somewhere else, that just tells you right away that it's not inevitable, right? You can avoid it. And we wouldn't understand that if we didn't sort of look at the group level. And if we really wanted to get serious about reducing the overall burden of disease, it's definitely something that applies not to any one group, but to everyone. So thank you very much.